Okay, let's use the concept of loops to process files, especially when we don't know the total number of contents or total number of lines of data that we are trying to read from the files. So basically, loops are typically involved in files, like with respect to files, when you are trying to read or write the contents to or from a file. So the read line method uses an empty string, and like we don't know the concepts of sentinel here. We have discussed this in maybe chapter 3 or chapter 4, but especially when we are reading the when we are using the while loop. So here, when working with files, if you have reached to an empty string, or if the output of a particular line is an empty string, then the program understands that it is that you have reached towards the end of the file, and that is where you must terminate reading the process of data from the file. So we'll see, like this is important when you are using the while loop, because when you do not make this condition false, we do have a chance of getting an infinite loop when using the while loop. So that's the reason why you'll be using empty string as your sentinel to make this while loop false. I hope everything that I just said makes sense, because it must make sense if you have already, as we have already completed chapter 4 and now we are at chapter 6. So if you do not understand what I've mentioned with respect to sentinels and then while loop, go back to chapter 4, go through the while loop again. Okay, so this is the basic syntax. You have opening the file, you are reading the first line from the file because you must start the process. And we also must make sure that, we have some condition, and the variable that you are using for condition should be declared first. So the read line, to read the first line, that is the variable that is associated with this read line method, will be used as our condition. So is that an empty string? If yes, then close the file. If not, move on to the next line, read the data, process the data, do whatever the program has to do, and then check again. Then if that is an empty string, then just close the program. So here is an example. So you are basically opening the sales.txt for reading. We don't know the contents of sales.txt. We have never seen the sales.txt for now, at least. So you are basically creating a file object, that is sales file is equal to open sales.txt in the mode R. And then you do know that the sales.txt has some number of lines, right? So I'm creating my variable as line is equal to the file object dot read line. So this is basically returning the first line of your file in the format of a string. So as long as this while line is not equal to an empty string, so if it is an empty string, then that means there is no data in the file. That is what we are trying to understand. So this is also important to remember, that when you're writing something contents or writing some contents into the file, make sure that you are not leaving the first line empty. If you leave the first line empty while writing, when you are reading the same file, it will just stop the execution of this while block completely because the first line is empty. So don't do such mistakes. So now while line is not equal to an empty string, colon, you are trying to convert each and every line into a numerical data, because as the name itself, it's sales. So sales are numerical data. So I'm just converting that to float just to be sure if it has any decimal values. So float of line print. We also know the format function, format amount point to F. Next, to make this condition false, we must always have this statement here, right? Like from the chapter 4 example, while keep going is equal to y, you have the statements, and then towards the end in the while block, you always ask the user if the user wants to continue, right? Keep going is equal to enter y if you want to continue. See, similarly, as we want this line data to be, the next line, or to be the new line, or to move from the read position line 1 to read position line 2, we will be using line is equal to sales file dot read line again. So when this statement is executed again, this is now reading line 2. So this line 2 will be checked in the condition of the while block, and then you are checking if that is an empty string. If it is not, the operations are performed. And let's say you have like 5 different lines of data in the sales.txt, and after 5 iterations, your line is equal to sales.readline will give you an empty string because there is no more data in the file. So this empty string as empty string is not equal to an empty string is false. You are not executing the while block. You're just moving on to close the file. Call the main function. I hope the working of this program is clear. It should be clear. If it is not, go back to chapter 4, revise the concept of loops. Now using Python's for loop to read lines. So if you want to read the contents of the file, then you can always use for loop as well. So you could use while, you could use for, it's up to you. So for the syntax for will be for target variable in whatever that you are looking at. Here we are basically looking at the file object because file object is already associated to the file along with the mode that we specify the file to be accessed in. So we have for line in file object statements. So the loop will iterate over each line of the file. So when you are using the for loop, there is no need to mention the empty string, or when there is no need to mention the sentinel. So even if you are writing the data with an empty string in the first line and then you are having multiple empty strings or multiple empty lines in your file, it doesn't matter because you are using for loop. So let's look at the same example, sales.txt in the read mode. Sales file is your file object. So for line, basically the target variable is the line here. So for line in file object, amount is equal to float of line. Next, print amount. Sales file dot close. That's it. So this is going to iterate for all the lines in the sales file. That is basically how the for loop works. Again, if you do not understand the working of this block, go to chapter 4 and then revise the concepts of loops. Okay, so and then the next topic will be processing records. So basically processing a record is basically a record is nothing but a set of data that describes one entity or one item. So you could say employee is your item, employee is your record, and the fields, that is the name of the employee, salary of the employee, number of hours the employee has worked, number of years the employee has been working. These are the 4 different features of this employee, which are also called as fields. So record is nothing but set of data that describes one particular item, and the features or various aspects that we are going to consider for this item are also known as fields. So when you are basically writing the records into the file, you must make sure that you are writing everything associated with that particular record in the same time. So at the same time, like at least one after the other. So when you are same thing when you are reading the contents, like when you are trying to read the record from a file, you must read everything at once or one after the other, and then you should move on to the different record once you are done with the first record. We'll see examples for better understanding. And record is basically displayed like this. So you have name field, ID number, and department field. So this is basically the record of an employee. Employee has a name, ID number, and the department in which the employee is working. So there are certain operations which can be performed on records, such as adding records, displaying records, searching for a specific record, modifying records, and deleting records. We'll be covering most of them in our lab session as well. Like in our lab, I think we have an example where we are trying to write the records and then perform all these operations on the records, or maybe in your programming assignment, but we will have that for sure. So here is an example that gets employee data from the user and saves it in the record, that is in the employee.txt file. So yeah, basically the first field is number of employees. So sorry, first you are asking the user the total number of employees that the user wants to create. So how many employee records do you want to create? The user will give you some number, and in this case the user said 3. Okay, so now you are opening the file employees.txt in the right mode. I would just use the out file as my file object or my variable. Here it is employee_file. It's up to you. So for count in range 1, number of employees plus 1. positive that most of you understand why I'm using the +1 and what the range function is. If you do not, please go back to chapter 5 and understand the concept of range again. Okay, so for count in range, 1 comma number of employees +1, I'm printing and enter the data for employee 1, name, ID, department. So I'm getting all the fields of this first employee at once. So I'm just getting one after the other. And then once I have this information, and I'm also making sure that I'm writing all the information together. So employee file dot write name plus \n, write ID number, write department. So what these 3 lines will enable us is basically writing all the information with respect to the first employee at one place. And then I'm displaying a blank line to make sure that the first record and the second record are easy to read. So as there is like no continuation, this blank line will be like a new line in this case right here. So after the first record, now he's entering the employee for the data for the second record. After the second record is done, the user is entering the data for employee 3, the third record. And once everything is written, you can just say employee records were written into employees.txt. So the takeaway is when you are processing records, especially when you are writing the data as a record into the file, you must write everything at once. So you must write at least one after the other. Same thing when you're trying to read the contents, you don't know that the first line is name because that's what we have defined. We have name, ID number, and department. That's the reason why I'm using name as my file object. Sorry, name as my variable name. Then I'm reading the first line from the file. While name is not equal to an empty string, in that case, I have ID number, read line, department, read line, and then I'm stripping the R strips from all of them together at once. Name, ID, department, \n. And then I'm displaying the name, ID, department, and print an empty line. Next, I am reading the name of the next record. So say this, I have like name, ID number, department of the first employee, name, ID number, and department of the second employee. So the name of the second employee is being read here. That is the next record. And now that is being checked for empty string. As it is not, we are taking the data of the ID number and department and then printing that by stripping the R strip as well. Close the file, main. So this is your output. So this makes us this is the end of processing records and how to write, read, and append the data into a file and how to read the contents from the file. In the next video, we'll be talking about exceptions.